Hello. When you're facing down the most dangerous Xenos enemies that the galaxy can throw at you, you're probably wanting the cavalry that turns up to help to be the biggest, burliest, badass Space Marines in Terminator armor you can imagine. But sometimes, you'd be better off if their little brothers showed up. Space Marine Scouts have been testing their mettle against the 41st millennium since almost the very beginning of Warhammer 40,000, and they've done so with fewer organs, fewer guns, and fewer clothes than their fully carded Space Marine battle brothers, proving that sometimes you don't need an invulnerable save or even a helmet to cause a little trouble. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and for the next 10 minutes or so, we'll be reconnoitering the history of the Space Marine Scouts. If Space Marines can be thought of as knights, then perhaps Space Marine Scouts could be thought of as their squires. Marines in training who are given all the dirty jobs, such as going inside living Tyranids as if they are Dennis Quaid in inner space. Of course, the idea of scout troopers is not something unique to the Space Marines in 40k. There are loads of reconnaissance units in different Warhammer armies. The Scouts of the Eldar are a great example that fulfill a similar role as the Rangers of the Wood Elves. But the Space Marine Scouts, the Marine cadets with all of the training and only some of the responsibilities, and none of the headgear of Space Marines, well, they have always been a little bit special. In the early army lists for Space Marines, you could field up to 3 of something called a reconnaissance squad, which the White Scars had nicknamed Pathfinders, so they could probably send the tower cease and desist at this point. Despite the implication of the name, these weren't really Scout Marines, as the only major difference between Recon Marines and a regular Assault Marine was the addition of energy and bioscanners that came at a premium of 6 extra points for the entire squad. There was not an early Rogue Trader boxed set of Space Marine Scouts. They didn't get all of the fanfare that some of the other squads would receive. In fact, there was no mention of Space Marine Scouts in Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader or any of the early supplements, but they did, surprisingly, get referenced in White Dwarf before the Terminators were even a thing. Shortly after Rogue Trader was released, White Dwarf began publishing the Index Astartes columns that expanded upon the lore of the setting, frequently focusing on the Space Marines, as you might guess from the name. In issue 105, we would get what would be the first mention of Scout Marines, after talking about the Raven Wing of the Dark Angels. Further examples of divergence from the strictures of the Codex can be seen in the many specialised Scout units in chapters throughout the Imperium. A couple of issues later, in November 1988's White Dwarf 107, we would get to see the first Scout for the first time. And though it's not quite what you might remember, it does have a lot of the hallmarks that would become important to the Scout designs in later evolutions. In an advert for new releases for Rogue Trader, we can see the glorious new Eldar Harlequin blister packs that bolster the recently released Jez Goodwin boxed set. And there's also a Mark Copplestone Tech Marine, a Jez Goodwin Imperial Assassin, and today's favourite friend, the first ever Space Marine Scout, as sculpted by Bob Naismith. This chap is not necessarily the best attired for combat in the far future, seeing as he doesn't even have a shirt on, but he looks like he means business nonetheless. Though the miniature predates the film by 4 years, I can't help but see some of Dolph Lundgren's Universal Soldier in this model, as well, of course, as plenty of Arnie and Stallone roles. Though the Scout doesn't really look like its contemporary Space Marine battle brothers, it is vaguely reminiscent of certain pieces of art from the main Rogue Trader book that have a certain pulpy science fiction style. Plus, it would only set you back 99p, which is about £3 each today. Unfortunately though, there were no rules for Space Marine Scouts in White Dwarf 107 or any of the issues near it. That wasn't something unique to Scouts. There was loads of stuff that was being released as miniatures that just didn't have rules during this time. Rogue Trader was evolving and expanding so quickly, the world was building so fast that there just wasn't time for the design studio to do stuff for everything, and it would take a lot of time before the actual universe of 40k really firmed up in the second edition. Until then, there would be bits and bobs of lore and new rules just scattered through new products and issues of the magazine. and there would be plenty more appearances of Space Marine Scouts before they would become a mainline squad. The Imperial Army, the forerunner to the Imperial Guard, which was the forerunner to the Astra Militarum, featured scout troopers in its army list in the first 40k supplement, the Book of the Astronomicon. The Imperial Army draws inspiration from many real-world sources, and it's not hard to imagine the reconnaissance troopers of, say, the US Army Rangers or Cavalry Scouts, or any number of other historical scout troops having been an influence on their inclusion here. And to go with its rules, the Imperial Army even got an official Scout Trooper mini, sculpted by Ali Morrison, though Scout Trooper Pank would remain a lone wolf throughout this entire era. It did occur to me, and there is nothing beyond tinfoil hat conspiracy here, that the actual Bob Naismith Space Marine Scout model that was released through White Dwarf could have been originally intended as an Imperial Army Scout, and that the later Space Marine Scouts, which were quite different when they did arrive, could have been the original intended Space Marine Scouts. But I'm just guessing here. It's pure speculation, no foundation in anything beyond the timelines. In any case, we would see some more Space Marine Scouts, and they would become something more familiar in their next appearance. May 1989's White Dwarf 113 featured 2 new Space Marine Scout models in its heavy metal section, and in the catalogue pages, you'd find both, alongside a third miniature now available to order. The 3 scouts were sculpted by Mark Copplestone, and they appeared roughly around the same time as Jez Goodwin's new Eldar scouts were also arriving on battlefields. Copplestone's brave young warriors looked awesome, but you would have a hard time fielding these guys on the tabletop as well, because they didn't have any rules either. It would be over a year before you would get actual official rules through conventional means to make use of Space Marine Scouts, and that fortune changed because of the release of a game called Advanced Space Crusade. Issue 131 of White Dwarf from November 1990 featured the Fangorn painted cover art for the new Advanced Space Crusade game, a more complicated and expandable sibling product to the recently released Games Workshop and MB Games collaboration, Space Crusade. In that family-friendly board game, squads of Space Marines assaulted a Space Hulk that's infested with all sorts of Xenos scum. But in the Jervis Johnson-designed Advanced game, squads of Space Marine Scouts are instead assaulting a Tyranid hive ship, and it is full of both Xenos and quite a few weird orifices. There was also a lot more lore about the role of the Scouts. When Space Marine recruits receive their surgical implants, they also undergo conventional training, hypnotic tutoring, and other instruction in tactics and weapon handling. When the Space Marine is ready, he is inducted into the Scout Company of his chapter. The Scout Company specializes in dangerous reconnaissance missions and infiltration of enemy lines. They usually fight ahead of the main line of advance, right at the forefront of battle, causing consternation among the enemy forces by striking where they least expect. Space Marine Scouts are fast and mobile, wearing lighter armor than ordinary Space Marines and being less heavily armed. They are led by veteran Space Marines, whose battlefield experience and bravery serve as examples of proper Space Marine conduct. A Space Marine Scout can only leave the Scout Company and become a full Space Marine warrior once his commander is satisfied that he has earned his place beside his battle brothers in the chapter's ranks. White Dwarf 132 showed off the full contents of Advanced Space Crusade, including a complete set of new plastic Space Marine Scout models. The minis in the box, including the Tyranids, were credited to Bob Naismith and Jez Goodwin. These new Scouts showed some key developments from the previous set, most notably the introduction of puffed and slashed sleeves, almost reminiscent of the Lanchnecht uniforms that would become commonplace in Warhammer Fantasy's Empire. The Scouts retained much of the regular Space Marine armor over the chest and legs, but they received much smaller pauldrons and no helmet, and many of them got mohawks to celebrate that fact. The same year that the plastic minis were released, there were also some metal versions made available as well, that were consistent in design with their plastic associates. David Gallagher provided what must be one of the most iconic pieces of Scout artwork for Advanced Space Crusade, an absolutely magnificent piece that still looks impressive to this day. So much so that it would even be used on the cover of a much later board game featuring the Space Marine Scouts, called Lost Patrol. Another board game that also made use of those same plastic scout models that had been created for Advanced Space Crusade was the 1991 small box game Ultramarines, which pitted squads of scouts against one another in search of alien artifacts on an abandoned space hulk. Designed by Andy Jones as part of a brief run of introductory games that made use of existing GW assets, it also included many of the tiles from the original Space Hulk game. Curiously, despite its name and featuring Ultramarines on the box art, the scouts in the box were actually cast in different coloured plastic, so as to represent Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, who were yellow for some reason, and the titular Ultramarines. All of which further confirms that this game is really about the platonic ideal of the Ultramarine, and not just the chapter of Ultramarines. The board game Ultramarines didn't really have a long-lasting impact on 40k in the same way that Advanced Space Crusade did, and that's because the latter of those two board games became a huge inspiration on Ian Watson, the author who wrote the first novels set in the 40k universe. Watson's second 40k book, Space Marine, was published in 1993, and it follows the story of 3 new recruits who rise through the ranks as scouts and then become fully fledged Space Marines, and it includes an assault on a Tyranid hive ship much like Advanced Space Crusade. Then the ship would jink even closer into a prosperous hilly suburb, if possible, to offload the Terror Scouts. The sergeants who would supervise the scouts were wearing hybrid body armour of eagle lastrons, flexible leggings, and great shoulder plates embossed with jewelled axes, but no helmets, for the more lightly armoured scouts wore no covering to their heads either. It was also in 1993 that the Space Marine Scouts got their first official rules, at least as far as I can find, for use in 40k, and they were written by Andy Chambers. They came in White Dwarf, in an article that also presented new rules for Eldar Scouts, and there was additional lore about the function of the Space Marine Scouts in Space Marine chapters. But by far the galaxy's most famed and feared scouts are those of the Space Marines and Eldar. It was a squad of Ultramarine scouts which destroyed the planetary defense headquarters on the rebellious planet of Icar 4, bringing the entire world to heel out of fear of planetary bombardment. Space Marine scouts of many different chapters have succeeded in destroying hundreds of Tyranid hive ships by fighting their way through these huge organisms and eliminating their vulnerable organs. Just a few months later would see the launch of the 2nd edition starter box for 40k, and with it came the Black Codex, an army list index for most of the current factions and squads available in the miniature range. The Scouts were largely unchanged from the Andy Chambers article, and then in the 2nd edition Ultramarines Codex, the Scouts would become a mainstay of future Space Marine armies. Though interestingly, there is no art or photography of any Scout miniature in the book. We are almost out of time, but I couldn't leave without at least mentioning some of my absolute favourite Space Marine Scouts, including what I think could possibly be the best Space Marine model ever designed. And I will leave you to snipe a peek at which one you think that is. This revised range was released in 1997 and sculpted by Jez Goodwin. In the book of collected sketches by Goodwin, The Gothic and the Eldritch, Andy Chambers offered a few insights about the design. The Scouts shown here represent the 5th attempt at getting them to look hardened enough. They wear stripped down Space Marine power armour, to which Jez has added knives, grenades, packs, sensors, and other Special Forces style equipment. This concept sketch was used to produce a range of Scout miniatures, one of the most popular of which is the Sniper with camouflage cape. See, I told you they were pretty cool. Alas, this is the end of our reconnaissance mission into the history of the Scouts. I will be doing more Space Marine Squad histories. There are a few to come, and you can find out more about what I'm collecting and what I'm researching in my project diaries for my Space Marine Army that I'm working on over the course of this summer. All of that is here on the channel. There is a playlist that's got the whole lot in. I'm really enjoying it. I hope you are too. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.